Hi, my name's Dan Coombs, I'm a painter, and we're here at the National Gallery in London to interview Richard Cork, the curator of David Bomberg and the Old Masters.
What we're looking at here is very much to do with living in London. He'd grown up here. He'd been born in Birmingham, but he'd lived in the East End of London since he was about 5 years old. He became more and more obsessed, like a lot of artists of his generation, with what the machine age, as they called it, was doing to humanity. And you can see that, I think, in his early work. And part of the reason why he moves towards abstraction is, I don't know, it's the whole notion of making things more mechanical. I wouldn't say it was a wholly positive thing for him, because the more you look at these paintings, the more you realize that they have a wealth of different meanings, actually. Some of which are to do with celebration of energy and vitality, certainly. But there are other things going on as well, like in this painting behind us.
And this painting that's called In the Hold, it depicts in a very abstract form some men working in the hold of a ship. It almost predicts the work of an artist like Bridget Riley. Do you think at this point he was heading towards a kind of pure abstraction, or is the figurative element very necessary for this particular artist? Or?
Well, funnily enough, that's a very good question, because it looks as if he's pushing it right towards abstraction. And in a way he is. But you look at the drawing for In the Hold, and you realize that it's not just about men in a ship, it's also about men who are helping people to come out of the hold of the ship, presumably onto dry land, dockland, beyond. And it makes you realize that very probably it's to do with the whole experience of being a migrant family and coming to the end of your voyage, coming to the end of that, and finding yourself in a new land. And a lot of the tension in the painting, and it is full of explosive kind of fragments, isn't it? Almost like splinters. You realize that that's probably to do with this alarming experience that migrants would have had when they reached this unknown country. And of course, Bomberg grew up in the East End of London, which was full of people who'd had that experience. And indeed, Bomberg's own parents had come over from their native Poland to escape from anti-Semitism. And in 1913, the year when he started on painting In the Hold, he went over to Paris with his friend Jacob Epstein, who introduced him to all kinds of France-based artists like Picasso and Modigliani. And he was, of course, gripped by what they were trying to do and searching for a new art. I mean, that was what seized the attention of so many young artists at that time. And a lot of them, of course, formed themselves into isms, became groups and movements. So there was a very explosive atmosphere. And Wyndham Lewis, when he decided to start the Vorticist movement in 1914, he invited Bomberg to become a member. But Bomberg wanted to stay on his own. He didn't like signing group manifestos.
Interesting.
He wanted to be his own man.
But looking at Bomberg's work, it makes you wonder whether there is such a thing as pure abstraction, or whether abstraction always needs the figurative. Well,
he certainly used words like pure form when he was painting these pictures. But at the same time, when you look at the paintings themselves, you realize that it's not that pure in terms of, you could not call them total abstractions. You are very aware, even in this one, where he imposes this extraordinary grid of 64 squares on the painting, and it kind of splits up everything. So if you look at one particular square within the grid, it is actually like looking at an abstract picture, isn't it? When you take the totality, the more you look at it,
you can just see it.
You can just about kind of begin to realize that there are fingers stretching up from the bottom, for example, here. And this gigantic man in pale blue, whose arms stretch right across the picture.
Do you think in the drawing, the squares and the triangles are the familiar technique of sort of gridding up when you're enlarging a drawing onto a canvas? And do you think the idea of turning it into an abstract painting may have come through the process, that process of gridding up?
I think you're absolutely right, because before Bomberg went to the Slade School of Art, he went to evening classes which were taught by Sickert, Walter Sickert. And if you look at Sickert's work, you realize that he very often started off a painting with the grid. But of course, Sickert wanted to paint over the grid. He wouldn't have left it visible in the final painting. And that's what's revolutionary about In the Hold, because Bomberg says, okay, I'm going to take this grid and make it almost sort of painfully visible. So it's almost shocking, isn't it?
It seems very radical painting for its time.
It's incredibly radical, and it shocked a lot of people when it was first put on view and attracted a huge amount of attention. So the following year, in 1914, Bomberg was able to have a big solo show in London at the Chanil Gallery in Chelsea, and he had 55 works on view there, including this masterpiece, The Mud Bath. The show was held in July 1914, and almost immediately the world was pitched into the war. And that changed everything, really. And so it wasn't simply a question of whether Bomberg was a success or a failure. Everybody was caught up in this nightmare world. And if you look at this painting, I think one of the aspects of it which fascinates us now is that if you wanted to find a title for the First World War itself, you could in fact call it The Mud Bath, couldn't you? And so it's quite uncanny that Bomberg, before the First World War, managed in a way to prophesy what was to come, because these figures almost seem to be involved in a very violent commotion, don't they? You could easily see them, especially the ones here, as fighting each other. He had a horrible time, because he started off like so many young men, feeling very brave, very patriotic. In fact, you can see the Union Jack colours in this painting, can't you, in a way? And he volunteered quite quickly after the war started. First of all, he was turned down.
Why was that?
Well, according to his first wife, Alice, it was because he had a beard, which I can't really believe, and because he was Jewish, which I can't really believe either. But it was probably to do with his whole sort of attitude of being a rebel artist. There's something about that might not have appealed to the particular military officer who was interviewing him, I don't know. But certainly he then joined the army and fought very bravely and very well for quite a long time. And then, of course, like so many young men in the war, he started losing his friends, his family. He lost a brother. He lost one of his closest friends, Isaac Rosenberg. And he became desperate, had a kind of nervous breakdown towards the end of the war. So he was very, very lucky in a way to receive this commission from the Canadians. And it was part of a very ambitious scheme over in Ottawa, in Canada, which was run by a young man called Max Aitken, who later on became very famous in England as the newspaper magnate Lord Beaverbrook. And Beaverbrook was very keen on art and commissioned not only Canadian painters but also British artists to do these huge, I mean, this is a whopper of a painting.
Is it like 15 feet high or something?
It's massive. And Bomberg was very, very excited, and you can sense the excitement, can't you?
The format actually reminds me of Peter Doig or Chrysophilia. It's kind of that very vertical format. Yeah. Feels very contemporary.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? Yeah, you're right.
But it says in your writing that it was rejected for being, and the man who rejected it was extremely rude about this painting. So this very flat way it was painted was very, very radical at the time. I mean, nobody had seen painting like this.
Although he's returning to a sort of figurative art compared to the mud bath, at the same time, you're right, he's still experimenting away like crazy. And if you go close to the painting, you realise quite how almost abstract it is. And it does have a curiously contemporary feel. You almost sense that it could have been painted yesterday.
He had a really hard time as an artist gaining recognition, and the end of his life, he was teaching an evening class, wasn't he, at Borough Polytechnic?
That's right. Yes, that was just after the Second World War, yeah.
How did he deal with that struggle?
Well, it was actually very difficult for him, as you might imagine. He managed to paint quite a lot of his later career, but there was a period around the time that he was teaching when he hardly did any of his own work at all. And I think one of his aspects as a teacher was that he got incredibly involved with the young students that he was teaching, and they benefited from that enormously. He was always sort of encouraging them, telling them to do another one, showing them what he could do. He wasn't one of these sort of distant teachers at all.
He was a very passionate man.
Very passionate, and much more revolutionary in his approach to art than most art schools were at that time.
Yeah.
So I think an awful lot of the young artists who went to his class were very, very excited, actually.
And he wanted people to draw very fast, very gesturally with charcoal, and he had an expression to do with capturing the mass of a form. That was very important. That was so influential to Auerbach.
Yes.
And Kossoff, but particularly Auerbach, I think, really took that, didn't he?
Yes, he called it, the whole phrase was, he wanted to catch the spirit in the mass. And that's a good word for Bomberg, actually, because spirit is very much what he's trying to capture, isn't it? You feel in his later work that it's full of this kind of dynamic quality, although very different, of course, from the paintings here. It's a different kind of dynamism, and he's relating to the natural world, whereas here he's not really looking at pastoral scenes at all, is he?
So Richard, this is a painting from 1913 called Ju-Jitsu, and I think a lot of people would be quite surprised to hear that Ju-Jitsu was being practiced in the East End. Was Bomberg into martial arts, or?
Well, the thing is, he had a brother called Mo, spelt M-O, Mo Bomberg, who was a boxer.
Wow, a good professional boxer, or?
He was a professional boxer, and he went to the gym all the time. And so the location of this very abstract painting is actually an East End gymnasium where not only boxing went on, but I think more importantly, wrestling. And the Japanese art of wrestling was something that really did interest Bomberg quite a lot. And you can understand why, because he was fascinated by the strength and the dynamism and the vitality of human bodies, wasn't he? And so you can imagine that wrestling might well have absolutely captivated him.
And he'd go and watch his brother box, and he'd go and watch the wrestling and maybe sketch the wrestling.
Yeah, sure.
It's got an incredible sort of rhythm. It's almost like you can hear the wrestlers being thrown onto crash mat. The whites are quite aggressive. It's quite a forceful use of white, isn't it, in this?
And it's also sort of slightly alarming, isn't it? Because you get the feeling that at any minute somebody may be being hurt by this. Somebody's bone might be quite possibly broken. So there's that element in it too, isn't there?
There's an element of sort of shattering, almost the forms are shattering, and
Very
again,
much.
the sort of broken mirror effect.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that somebody so involved in abstract painting should also simultaneously be referencing something so specific in terms of
East
a
End
sport
life.
or East End life or place.
Yeah, that's right.
Very, very interesting.
That's
isn't
right.
it?
And you'd never guess if you took your first glance at this that it is based on East End life, would you?
No.
Not at all.
No. You used the word uncanny in relation to the mud bath, and it also applies to this painting, because I think the vision of Ezekiel from the Old Testament involves the dead coming back to life. Is that right? So would you say this is a kind of painting that's more haunted by mysticism or his religious upbringing, or?
I think, funnily enough, the word haunting is spot on, because this picture was painted in 1912, and Bomberg himself was hit by a terrible family tragedy in that very year, when his mother Rebecca, who was only 48 at the time, she died very suddenly of pneumonia, and he was very, very close indeed to her. His father hadn't really understood what he wanted to be in life, but his mother had understood almost instinctively that David was an incredibly talented young man. She not only got hold of a tiny little room for him within their East End building to use as his studio, but she backed him all the time. And funnily enough, more or less the exact plot of land where the building used to be and was later demolished is now inhabited by Tracy Emin's studio.
Wow, so Tracy Emin is working on the spot where Bomberg lived. Yes. Do you think she's aware of that?
Isn't that funny? I think she is aware of that, yes. Yes, there's something quite moving about that.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
In this painting, because of the story, the sense that he's really trying to animate these figures reminded me, when I saw it, of the sequence in film Jason and the Argonauts, the 60s film where the skeletons come to life. It's animated by Ray Harryhausen. And it's a very famous sequence because it has that uncanny effect of something inanimate becoming animate. And this painting, again, has that quality. It's a subject, though, that one would never associate with somebody involved with abstract painting or vorticism.
Well, I can see why you say that, but in a funny kind of way, this whole notion of rebirth, of taking something which is dead and giving it new life, I think is very much to the point when it comes to Bomberg's ambitions as a young artist. I think he identified with that whole notion of a rebirth, rebellion for him was part of that whole notion.
Reinvention of the self.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did he have a mystic side? Or you said earlier he was a communist at one point and actually went to Russia, but it sounds like he had a lot of things he was interested in. He wasn't just one thing.
No, I think he had a very busy mind, actually.
And do you think he had a sort of, is there a mystical element to his work of transformation, or perhaps going back into the Jewish religion, or was he trying to get away from that?
I think there is something very spiritual in his work, although it's grounded very much in what he was experiencing as an East End boy growing up in Whitechapel.
Bomberg went to Toledo in order to look at El Greco, and this is a painting that's from the studio of El Greco, but I think following almost very precisely one of El Greco's compositions. What do you think Bomberg got from El Greco?
Well, I think he was very excited when this painting was acquired by the National Gallery, because it was in 1919, and he was actually working on that painting when suddenly this El Greco appeared in the National Gallery, and it created quite a storm at the time, because a lot of people had never seen anything like it, certainly not in the National Gallery, and it got very controversial. And Bomberg fell in love with it and even gave a lecture on this painting.
Did he?
Yes, he did.
And do you know what he said about the painting?
Yes, he was very preoccupied with the colours, particularly what he described as the pinks and the purples. But also, of course, this extraordinary way in which El Greco breaks all the rules in terms of composing a picture. So you're never quite sure what is where and where is what.
It's almost like being within a kind of drapery. The moon is almost behind a kind of fold. It's very cubist.
Yes, and if you look back from this painting to Sappers at work there, I think you can actually realise that he got a certain kind of spirit from the El Greco painting, didn't he, in this picture?
This is a similar sort of scale. This is like a large El Greco painting you sort of look up at, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.